She buried her husband on a Tuesday and joined the wagon train on a Wednesday. The men watched her come, this woman in black with dust on her boots and a rifle slung across her back like she'd been born wearing it. They expected tears. They expected a widow who would slow them down, who would weep at night and beg for help with her oxen. Instead, she yoked her own team before sunrise, checked her own wheels, and stared down the first man who offered to drive her wagon out of Christian charity. "I drove it here," she told him. "I'll drive it the rest of the way." By the end of the first week, the men had stopped offering. By the end of the second, they had started whispering. A woman who shot straighter than they did, a woman who didn't cry, a woman who didn't need them. They feared her the way men fear anything they cannot understand. All except one. He watched her differently, not with suspicion, not with pity, but with something quieter, something that looked almost like respect. Neither of them knew yet that the trail would break them both before it ever brought them together. Her name was Margaret Doyle, and she was 31 years old. She was not beautiful in the way the trail songs described women. She was tall and lean, with dark hair she kept braided tight and pinned beneath a wide hat. Her hands were rough. Her eyes were the color of river stone, gray and steady, and they did not look away from anything. She had grown up on a hard farm in Ohio, the only daughter among 5 sons. Her father had needed hands more than he needed daughters, so she had learned to do everything her brothers did. She could mend a harness, set a broken bone, read the weather in the clouds, and skin a deer before most girls her age had learned to dance. She had married a kind man named Thomas, a man who had dreamed of land in Oregon. They had sold everything for the journey west, and 3 weeks before the wagon train left Independence, Thomas had taken a fever and died in a boarding house bed, holding her hand and apologizing for leaving her alone. She had not cried at his grave. She had cried in private where no one could see, where weakness could not be used against her. Because Margaret had learned something hard and true in her life. The world did not protect women who showed they could be hurt, so she had built walls. She let no one close. She trusted no one but herself. And that was why she was lonely in a way that no one on that train could see. She was surrounded by 60 people, and she belonged to none of them. The man who watched her was named Eli Brandt. He was 36, and he was the scout the company had hired to guide them across the plains and through the mountains. He was a broad-shouldered man with weathered skin and a beard streaked early with gray. He rode ahead of the train most days, alone, reading the land like other men read scripture. Eli was the best guide on the frontier, and everyone knew it. He had crossed the trail 11 times. He knew where the water was, where the Indians camped, where the river could be forded, and where it would swallow a wagon whole. The men trusted his judgment with their lives. But Eli rarely spoke more than he had to. He kept to himself. He ate alone at the edge of the firelight and slept apart from the others, and the families who hired him assumed he simply preferred his own company. The truth was darker. 6 years earlier, Eli had guided another train across these same plains. He had grown careless just once, near a swollen river. He had told them it was safe to cross. It had not been safe. A wagon had overturned in the current, and a woman and her 2 small children had been pulled under and lost while Eli watched, helpless, from the bank. He had carried their faces with him every day since. He had sworn he would never again let himself care about the people he guided, because caring made a man careless, and carelessness killed. So Eli kept his walls too. He guided people. He did not love them. He delivered them to Oregon and rode away and never looked back. He was lonely in the same way Margaret was. He just hid it better. When Eli first saw Margaret Doyle, he made the same mistake every other man made. He looked at the black dress and the fresh grief and assumed she would be a burden. A widow alone, no husband to drive her team, no man to protect her. He had seen women like her break down 100 miles in. He had seen them sit and weep while the train waited. He decided, before he ever spoke to her, that she would be trouble. And Margaret, for her part, had decided the same about him. She watched the silent scout ride past the wagons each morning without a word, and she thought him cold, arrogant, a man too proud to speak to ordinary people. She had known men like that, men who believed their skill gave them the right to look down on everyone else. She decided she would keep her distance from Eli Brandt. Both of them were wrong. Neither of them knew it yet. Their first real clash came on the 8th day. A storm had blown in fast off the plains, the kind that turned the trail to mud and the sky to iron. The wagon master called for the train to stop and circle, and in the chaos, Margaret's lead ox slipped in the muck and went down hard, tangled in its yoke, bellowing. Eli rode back through the rain and dismounted beside her wagon. He reached for the ox without a word, expecting to do the work himself, expecting the woman to stand aside. "Don't," Margaret said sharply. "You'll panic him, move slow." Eli stopped. He looked at her, rain streaming down both their faces. "I've done this before," he said. "So have I." For a moment they stared at each other, two stubborn people in a storm. Then Margaret knelt in the mud beside the thrashing animal, murmured something low and calm, and worked the yoke free with her bare hands while the ox stilled beneath her touch. She stood, soaked to the bone, and met his eyes. "I don't need rescuing, Mr. Brandt." "I can see that," he said. He walked away, and both of them were angry, and both of them were thinking about the other long after the storm had passed. The men of the train took notice of that storm too. They had seen the scout walk away from the widow with his jaw tight, and they decided among themselves that she was even more trouble than they'd feared. A woman who'd argue with Eli Brandt in a storm was a woman who'd get someone killed. But Eli had seen something they hadn't. He had seen the way she calmed that ox. He had seen hands that knew animals, knew fear, knew how to gentle a panicking creature with patience instead of force. He had spent his whole life around people who handled animals badly, and here was a woman who did it better than he did. It bothered him. It bothered him for days. He started watching her differently after that, not with suspicion now, but with curiosity. He watched her wake before everyone else and have her fire going while the men were still stumbling out of their bedrolls. He watched her fix a cracked wheel hub with a competence that shamed the wheelwright. He watched her sit up 2 nights running with the Coleman baby, who had taken sick with a cough, dripping water and honey between the child's lips while the exhausted mother slept. The widow Doyle, he realized, was not a burden at all. She was the most capable person on the train, including himself. And slowly, scene by scene, the cold scout began to thaw. He started leaving things for her. A wild turkey dressed and ready set quietly by her wagon at dawn. A patch of good grass he'd scouted ahead, mentioned offhand so she could rest her team. He never made a show of it. He never expected thanks. But Margaret noticed. She noticed, and it confused her, because cold and arrogant men did not do quiet kindnesses for widows they thought beneath them. One evening she found him kneeling by her broken-down wagon, replacing a worn linchpin he'd noticed that morning, his hands working in the failing light. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know," Eli answered, not looking up. "You'd have done it yourself by morning. I just figured you've earned a night's sleep more than most." It was the kindest thing anyone had said to her since Thomas died. She didn't have words for it. She just stood there in the dusk and felt something crack a little in the wall around her heart. The change came gradually for both of them, across the long weeks of the trail. Margaret began to understand that Eli's silence was not pride. It was grief. She saw it in the way he flinched whenever the train neared a river. She saw it in the way he counted the children every morning, his lips moving, as though afraid one might vanish. And Eli began to understand that Margaret's hardness was not coldness. It was armor. He saw it in the way she turned away when the Coleman baby finally recovered and the grateful mother embraced her. Margaret didn't know how to be held anymore. She'd forgotten how to let kindness in. They were two people who had each decided, separately, that the safest thing in the world was to need no one. And they were beginning, despite everything, to need each other. The turning point came at a river crossing in the 3rd month. The water was high and fast from rain in the mountains, and Eli stood on the bank for a long time studying it, his face gray. The wagon master grew impatient. The families grumbled. They wanted to cross and be done with it. But Eli would not move. He stood frozen, staring at the brown current, and Margaret saw something in his face that she recognized, because she had worn it herself at her husband's grave. She walked down to the bank and stood beside him. "What happened here?" she asked quietly. "Not here, but somewhere like it." Eli was silent a long moment, and then, for the first time in 6 years, he told someone the truth. He told her about the overturned wagon, about the woman and her 2 children, about how he had said it was safe, and how he had watched the river take them while he stood helpless on the shore. "I swore I'd never let it happen again," he said, his voice rough. "So I check everything twice, and I never let myself care about the people I'm taking across, because the last time I cared I got careless, and caring got them killed." Margaret looked at him for a long time. "You've got it backwards," she said gently. "It wasn't caring that killed them. It was one bad guess on one bad day that any man could have made. You've been punishing yourself for being human." Then she did something she had not done since Thomas died. She reached out and took his hand. "We'll find a safer crossing," she said. "Together. There's no shame in waiting for the water to drop." They waited 2 days. The water dropped. They found a wide, shallow ford a few miles upstream, and the whole train crossed without losing so much as a chicken. And that night, by a fire that for once they shared, Eli Brandt looked at Margaret Doyle and understood that he had fallen in love with the one woman every other man on the train was afraid of. But the trail was not finished with them. In the high country, where the air turned thin and cold, fever swept through the wagon train. It started with the children and moved to the old, and within a week half the company lay sick in their wagons, burning and shivering. Margaret did not get sick. She moved from wagon to wagon, day and night, with her sleeves rolled up and her river-stone eyes fierce with purpose. She broke fevers with cool claws. She forced broth between cracked lips. She delivered the Halloran baby early by lantern light while the mother shook with chills, and she did not sleep for 3 days running. And then on the 4th day, Margaret collapsed. She had given everything to everyone else and saved nothing for herself, and the fever, when it finally took her hard. She burned hotter than any of them. She slipped in and out of sense, calling for Thomas, calling for her brothers, calling for people long gone and far away. The train could not stop. Winter was coming on fast, and the pass ahead would close with the first heavy snow. The wagon master made the hard call. They had to keep moving, sick or not, or none of them would survive the mountains. It was Eli who refused to let her be left behind in a jolting wagon to die. He gave up his place at the head of the train. He tied his horse to her wagon and climbed inside, and for 6 days and 6 nights he did not leave her side. He cooled her fever with snowmelt. He held her up to drink. He talked to her for hours, even when she could not hear him, telling her about Oregon, about the green valleys waiting, about all the years they might have if she would only stay. The men who had feared her watched the silent scout pour his whole heart into saving the widow they'd whispered about, and slowly, quietly, they began to be ashamed of themselves. On the worst night, when her breathing went shallow and the fever climbed past anything he'd seen a person survive, Eli did something he had not done since the river took those children 6 years before. He prayed. He knelt in that swaying wagon and he begged God or fate or whatever was listening not to take this one too. Not this woman. Not when he had only just found her. He told her in the dark, the thing he had never told a living soul. "I love you, Margaret Doyle, Don't you leave me on this trail. I've buried too many people. I can't bury you." Whether it was the prayer, or the medicine, or simply her own iron will, the fever broke before dawn. She woke to find Eli asleep beside her, his hand still wrapped around hers, his face haggard and gray with exhaustion. And she remembered dimly, through the fog of the fever, a voice in the dark telling her not to go, telling her it was loved. When the train finally came down out of the mountains into the green Willamette Valley, Margaret Doyle was thin and weak but alive. The whole company had survived. Not one person had been lost. The families gathered around her wagon to thank her. The men who had feared her took off their hats. One by one they came forward, ashamed and humbled, and admitted what they should have seen from the start, that the woman they had been afraid of was the strongest and best among them, and that she had saved their lives. But Margaret was not looking at them. She was looking at Eli, who stood a little apart, the way he always had, watching her with his whole heart in his eyes. She walked to him on unsteady legs. The whole train fell silent. "I heard you," she said quietly. "In the wagon, in the dark, I heard what you said." Eli's jaw tightened. He had no walls left to hide behind. "I meant it," he said, "every word." Margaret reached up and laid her rough, capable hand against his weathered cheek. "I spent my whole life believing I didn't need anyone," she said. "And you spent yours believing you didn't deserve anyone. We were both wrong, Eli Brandt." He covered her hand with his. "I don't want to ride away from this train and never look back," he said. "Not this time, not from you." "Then don't," she said. "Stay." And he did. They were married that autumn in the Green Valley, under a sky washed clean by mountain rain, with the whole wagon train gathered round them as witnesses. The men who had once feared Margaret Doyle stood with their hats in their hands and their wives at their sides, and they wept openly, every one of them, because they had learned at last what kind of woman she truly was. They built a house together at the edge of the valley, near good water and rich soil. Eli never guided another train. He had carried enough people across enough rivers. Now he stayed in one place, and he learned slowly that staying could be its own kind of courage. Margaret learned too. She learned how to let herself be held. She learned that needing someone was not the same as being weak. She learned that the walls she had spent a lifetime building had only ever kept her lonely, and that the bravest thing she had ever done was take a frightened man's hand on a riverbank and tell him he was worth saving. They had children of their own in the years that followed, and Eli counted them every morning the way he always had, his lips moving. But now he counted them not out of fear, but out of gratitude. The men of that train had looked at a woman in black and seen something to fear, because they could not understand a woman who needed no one. They had been wrong. She had never been hard. She had only been waiting, all that long and lonely time, for the one man who would look past the armor and see the warmth beneath. The one man who would not try to rescue her, but would simply stand beside her and let her stand beside him. Every man on that wagon train had feared her. One man had respected her. And in the end, that one man was the only one who had ever truly seen her at all.